Back in 1988, 23-year-old Pauline got a phone call from her mum. She was staying at a nearby motel and wanted to meet her for a chat. During this call, she would tell Pauline that she was finally ready to tell her the entire truth about her childhood. Hi folks, I'm Johnny and welcome to The Oddest. This is a story that's genuinely unbelievable. It's like something right out of a high-stakes thriller. But it's completely true. Let's take a wee look. As a kid, Pauline Dakin always had a hunch that there was something wrong and odd about her family. Years later, her suspicion would turn out to be true. See, it all started back in 1970 when she was just 5 years old. Her parents, Ruth and Warren, separated. Frankly, it wasn't a huge surprise to Pauline. Her father, Warren, had a habit of heavy drinking and was known to be violent. After the separation, Pauline, her mother and her brother moved to a different house in Vancouver, Canada. But something strange started to happen. Her mother began to act anxious all the time, but Pauline just couldn't figure out why. When Pauline turned 9, her mum dropped a bombshell on her and her brother. They were going on a vacation to Winnipeg, which was 1,000 miles away from their hometown in Vancouver. Excited, they packed up their bags and hit the road. But once they arrived in Winnipeg and settled into their new vacation home, Ruth broke the news to her kids that they were never returning back to Vancouver. Pauline and her brother were devastated. But what about Dad? They asked. Well, Ruth replied with a cryptic answer. This is the way it has to be. When you're older, I will explain everything. And just like that, Pauline and her brother had to start a new life over in Winnipeg, confused and saddened by the sudden upheaval. For 4 long years, Pauline never saw her father and gradually lost touch with him. Despite the initial shock of leaving Vancouver, Pauline began to settle into her new home in Winnipeg and even made a few close friends. However, just as she was starting to feel comfortable, her mother would drop another bombshell. They needed to move again, and this time it was all the way to New Brunswick, on the far east side of Canada. Her mother made them swear not to tell anyone about the move, but later on that day, whilst hanging out with her best friend Wendy, Pauline accidentally let it slip that she was leaving. When Ruth finally came to pick up Pauline from Wendy's house, the two girls had to put on an act and say their goodbyes in a nonchalant way so as not to raise any suspicion. Once they arrived in New Brunswick, the family put down roots and stayed there for many years. But Pauline's mother was still incredibly anxious and paranoid about something, and the kids still had no idea what it was.
All we knew was that once we went on vacation from North Vancouver, where we were living, to Winnipeg, and then we're told, hey, we're never going home. And then the other time we were told we were moving, but we were sworn to secrecy.
Let's jump ahead now to 1988, when Pauline was just 23 years old. She had moved 2 hours away from the family home in New Brunswick and was living with her boyfriend whilst working as a reporter for the local newspaper. One day her mother called her up and said, "Hey, I'd like to meet you at this motel I'm staying at. I'm finally ready to spill the beans about your childhood." Pauline was both intrigued and excited. After all, this was a conversation that had been decades in the making. Pauline eagerly headed up to the motel to meet her mum. When she arrived, she saw Ruth pacing around anxiously outside. As she approached her, her mum gestured to her to be quiet and handed her an envelope. On it was written, "Don't say anything. Put your jewellery inside this envelope. It's probably bugged. I will explain everything inside. Just please don't speak." Pauline was taken aback by her mother's strange behaviour, but she did as she was told and followed her inside the room. As Pauline entered the room, she was surprised to see another guy in there. His name was Stan Sears and was well known to Pauline and her mum. The reason they knew him was that he was the local reverend at the church that they attended way back in Vancouver. Pauline had already known that her mother and Stan were pretty tight. I mean, they kept in touch even after they bailed on Vancouver and moved out to Winnipeg and then in New Brunswick. Pauline could remember seeing Stan pop up every now and then to visit her mum, so it wasn't like this was some kind of big surprise. But then her mother would tell her something else that would shock her. See, it turns out that she and Stan had been secretly in love since their Vancouver days. This obviously was a shocking revelation for Pauline, but that shock would soon be overtaken by what her mother would tell her next.
Anyway, the two of them sat me down and said the reason that all these bizarre things had happened was that we'd been on the run from the mafia.
Pauline's mum told her everything, and it turned out that they had been on the run for all those years because Pauline's dad, Warren, was a mobster. Apparently, he was some bigwig in an organised crime outfit back in Vancouver. And when he and Pauline's mum split up, she found out that she was a marked woman. See, the mob didn't like the fact that Warren couldn't control her anymore and thought that she knew far too much. Stan found out that he was a target also. Ruth let him in on the secret that the mob wanted him dead because they knew about his romance with Pauline's mum. As it turned out, Stan was counselling a guy from his congregation who actually ended up being in the mob. And when the mob found out about this, they thought that this guy had spilled some crucial info to Stan, making him an even bigger liability. At first, Stan didn't buy into any of this, but when he found out that this guy had been whacked, he knew it was the real deal. They knew they couldn't simply turn to the cops, so they made the decision to go into hiding together. Pauline's mum knew all too well what happened to families that ratted out the mob. They were made examples of. Snitches get stitches, or worse. So they had to keep their heads down and hope for the best. As it turns out, when Pauline's family up and moved to Winnipeg and then on to New Brunswick, Stan moved right along with them. No wonder she'd seen him around their house every so often visiting their mum. When her mum dropped this bombshell on Pauline, she was understandably stunned, but at the same time she was almost relieved to finally have an explanation for all of the weird stuff that had gone down during her childhood. So, they all sat down together in this motel room and Pauline grilled them for hours on end, asking all sorts of questions, just trying to make sense of all of it. During their chat in this motel room, Pauline found out some crazy stuff about her childhood. Like, for instance, those times when she'd come home from school to find her mum tossing out all the food out of the fridge in the pantry. Well, that turns out that the mob had tried to poison them. There were 6 different times when Pauline was suddenly removed from one school and moved to another one across town. Why? Because there was a credible threat that the mob had figured out where she was going to school. So, over the course of the weekend, Pauline not only found out about this totally insane chapter of her life, but she also learned that the danger was far from over. Before she headed back home, she sat down with her mum and Stan and asked them how she could stay safe. That's when her mum would drop another bombshell. They were tired of living in hiding and had already reached out to the authorities. They had been moved into a special witness protection program for families with ties to the mob. When you sign up to this program, you're stepping into the weird world, a place where safety is never guaranteed. Undercover agents will be tracking your every move to prevent any possible assassination attempts. As soon as Pauline's mother mentioned their entry into the weird world, she revealed that a few agents were already secretly monitoring Pauline and her brother. Stan handed Pauline a radio that broadcasts to the agents following her every step, but he warned her. Using this radio was a serious matter, as it could mean risking someone else's life just to save yours. So only use this radio in an absolute emergency. Pauline clutched the radio tightly, her eyes shifting nervously between her mother and Stan. Her heart sank as she asked the one question that had been plaguing her for years. What happened to Dad? Is he in jail? Her mother's response only deepened her confusion. No, he wasn't in jail. He was also in the weird world. Her mother then handed her a letter from her father addressed specifically to Pauline. As she read the letter, her father's words echoed in her mind. He had been moved into the weird world and was just waiting for Pauline to join them when she was ready. As Pauline clutched the radio and the letter, her mind raced as she struggled to process everything that her mother and Stan had just revealed. Overwhelmed with emotions, her mother's voice broke through her daze. Go home and think about what you want to do next. If you want to join the witness protection program and enter the weird world with us, just let me know and we will make it happen. With a heavy heart and a head full of questions, Pauline hugged her mother and Stan before leaving the motel. As she sat in her car trying to make sense of it all, she noticed Stan running towards her. Something was clutched tightly in his hand. With a curious look on her face, she rolled down the window and listened, as he explained that he had forgotten to give her something very important. Holding up a round piece of metal, Stan revealed that this is a GPS transponder that she should discreetly attach to the underside of her car. The transponder was magnetised and would constantly transmit her location to the agents who were monitoring her movements. This would help them locate her quickly in case she was ever in any danger. Grateful for the added security, Pauline thanked Stan before placing the transponder under her car. She watched as Stan disappeared back into the motel. Pauline returned home with her mind spinning from the weight of the information that she had just received. Despite the agents monitoring her every movement and the added security of this GPS transponder, she just couldn't shake off the constant feeling of being watched. She initially planned to take a few days to process everything before deciding whether that she wanted to join this witness protection program and enter the weird world with her family. However, after only a couple of days, her paranoia reached an all-time high. She broke up with her boyfriend, she quit her job, and she moved into a different apartment. The feeling of being unsafe was just too much to bear. In desperation, she called her mother to tell her that she was ready to join the weird world. Her mother and Stan were thrilled with her decision, but they cautioned her that it was a complex process that would require her to give up her old life completely and start anew. Many people would be involved in helping her make this transition. It was like a well-oiled machine. Just as soon as Pauline made this decision, many elements would start moving in order to ensure her safe transition into the witness protection program. Pauline's anxiety and fear continued to grow as she waited for this phone call from her mother's agent. Despite her mother's reassurances that she would be contacted soon, she waited and waited for 5 years. In that time, of course, life would go on for Pauline. She would meet someone called Kevin who would eventually become her husband, and they would start to build a life together. During many conversations with her husband, Pauline began to think, could all of this be true? That was a question that constantly lingered in the back of her mind. That was until one day Pauline would frantically phone her mum. She contacted her mother and informed her that someone had broken into her apartment, expressing concerns that it might be someone from the mafia. Pauline asked her mother for advice on what to do and whether she should call the police. Her mother advised against calling the cops and promised to speak with Stan to determine the next course of action. After a few minutes, Pauline's mother would call her back and assured her that everything was under control. She explained that she had spoken to Stan, who in turn had contacted the undercover agents that had been surveilling Pauline all these years. According to them, 2 members of the mafia had indeed broken into Pauline's apartment, but they were apprehended and in custody. Therefore, there was no need for Pauline to worry, as she was now safe. It was at this exact moment that Pauline finally knew for a 100% certainty that her mum and Stan were just talking shite. They had been lying to her this entire time. She knew this for a fact because no one had broken into her house. It was all just a fabrication, a plan concocted by Pauline to test Ruth and Stan. Everything she had ever been told was a lie. There was no undercover agents. Her father was not part of a Vancouver crime syndicate. Stan was later diagnosed with delusional disorder, a condition in which a person has a fixed false belief despite evidence to the contrary. Unfortunately, during his relationship with Pauline's mother, his delusion was transmitted to her through a phenomenon known as folie à deux, or shared psychosis. Now, this folie à deux, or shared psychosis, it's an interesting phenomenon for sure. In fact, I've already covered another case in a previous video, which I will link in the description below. So this is a rare condition, and it occurs when a person with a psychotic disorder, in this case Stan, transfers their very real delusions to a person with whom they share a close relationship with. In this case, it was Pauline's mother. Even after Pauline confronted her mother and Stan about their delusions, they didn't admit to any wrongdoing. They genuinely believed that the mafia was after them, and they took this belief to their graves. Their primary concern was not that they had been exposed as potential frauds or liars, but rather that Pauline would be exposed to danger without using her GPS transponder, radio, or living with them in the weird world. They were worried that Pauline would genuinely be assassinated by the mafia. Despite never receiving an apology from her mother or having the opportunity to fully discuss the absurdity of this situation, Pauline found closure by writing a best-selling memoir called Run, Hide, Repeat. I'll link that in the description also. So, there you go. That's it for another video, folks. What do you think about this case? Thanks for watching. I genuinely appreciate every single one of you. Please take care out there, alright? Stay safe, tell someone you love them, and remember, keep smiling.